Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. It is time to take your questions, and we are going to start off this week with Martin on the Patreon. And Martin asks, how would Canada's parliament function better? Would Canada's parliament function better under a system of annual prorogations like they have in the UK and like Canada used to have? It's not something I've given a lot of thought to, but I think one of the things is that it's got a little less flexibility when you've got an annual prorogation schedule. One of the things I've observed is that there's a tendency in the UK when a bill comes up against a particular obstacle, that means it'll take longer than planned. They just tend to abandon it rather than go through the process. And I think that just has to do with the fact that the timelines are so much more compressed when you've got that kind of annual prorogation hanging over you. I also think that it can be a little less you're going to achieve fewer things on your government's list of plans and priorities if you've got an annual schedule hanging over you. Whereas if you've got one that's a little more flexible, then you can check off more things on your list when you end one session and start a new one. That said, I think the previous parliament, where it was all the parliament before the previous one, so that would have been, I guess, the 42nd, where, it was all just 4 years of one straight session, no prorogations in there at all. Think that one got a little bit ridiculous, in part because prorogation also provides resets for things like certain committee structures and so on, particularly in the Senate. So not having that created its own particular set of issues. There were workarounds that they could do, So I think there's a healthy balance to be achieved between having 2 or 3 within a session. Once you've got a government that's able to check off things from their to-do list essentially and start a new fresh session with some new ideas and to kind of refresh their agenda in there as well. But I don't know that having a slated annual one provides any other particular benefits to it. Another question from Martin here, who asks, given that the UK Supreme Court invalidated a prorogation on the grounds that illegal advice had been given to the Queen, how would you see that precedent playing out in Canada? Is it immaterial? What are the chances that the Supreme Court of Canada could invalidate a prorogation on such grounds? And taking that to the extreme, given the current calls to recall Parliament are constitutionally impossible, could the Supreme Court ever invalidate a dissolution on the grounds that the Governor General had been given illegal advice? So the precedent set in that UK case is fairly particular to the circumstances, and in particular having to do with the way that prorogation tends to work in the UK, where it's kind of a routine thing and generally for a couple of days. And then it comes back with a new session. And for Boris Johnson to have prorogued with the intention of kind of getting over a particular time deadline without having Parliament sitting was kind of playing fast and loose with the rules around it. Calling the prorogation outside of their usual annual schedule. And it was very much done for fairly nakedly tactical reasons, which, happens here in Canada as well. But I don't know that the circumstances around that particular invalidation are necessarily replicable in Canada under our particular way that prorogation tends to work in the same way. In terms of trying to get the courts to invalidate a dissolution, there have been attempts after the fixed election date law came into place where Democracy Watch tried to invalidate that particular dissolution. The fact that these fixed election laws are pretty much shams and don't really have any actual power is pretty much why the court wouldn't strike it down. In other words, the advice to the Governor General was legal because it's constitutionally legal, and there was no real, the fixed election date didn't invalidate that in any way. So there was nothing to contest it on. So with that in mind, I don't think that there is really any particular reason why a dissolution would be declared illegal. Because essentially, you're giving the population a chance to vote on the government and can hold them to account for that decision, and they just might under the current circumstances. So yeah, I don't think that particular precedent can really apply much in the Canadian context, or really with a dissolution. With that in mind. We've got one more from Martin, who asks, has Elections Canada ever considered not counting votes until all the polls are closed in all time zones? In other words, keeping the voting open until 10 p.m. local time, for example, but don't count anything until after all the polls close in BC. I don't know whether or not they've considered that. I mean, there's 150 years of precedent that I don't know all of. I know they've tried different things in terms of staggering poll times. So BCs, they tend to open earlier and close earlier than they do in other parts of the country. And they've kind of gotten used to that in BC, so it's not kind of an imposition the way it used to be. The laws around blackouts in terms of not reporting numbers until certain polls have closed in other regions, that kind of fell to the wayside under the way technology has changed. But I don't know that it's necessary. I'm not sure that there's a need for it. We don't tend to have the same kinds of patterns as they do in the US, where early reporting from the East Coast will influence votes in California, for example. That doesn't tend to really happen here, particularly because of the geographical concentration of seats in Quebec and Ontario. So it's hard to really influence much of an outcome from BC, unless it's a hung parliament. But the fact that there's only about an hour or so from when Ontario polls close and BC ones close, I think makes that kind of a moot point. But this is I'm sure there's been discussions around that, but I'm not sure what it really adds in terms of the way that our polling system tends to work. Our last question comes from someone who calls themselves SEB on Twitter, and they ask, why are people persuaded by media wagging stunts, or are they really? And that's kind of a tough one to answer, because I'm not sure how persuaded people are. I think part of it is the fact that we have some pretty poor media literacy in this country. A lot of people don't really know the ways in which to critically engage with news that they read, and know how to ask the right questions about it, and know how to really think critically about what it is that they're reading, because news is a kind of construct in and of itself. And at the same time, our own kind of journalistic institutions in this country have kind of degraded in terms of resources and availability and so on. So we're getting a lot more stories that are not really engaging critically with what the material is. And we've kind of slipped into this space where we're just kind of both sidesing everything out of this exaggerated sense of fairness in terms of this party says this party says that, you decide. I don't know that that's always particularly helpful, particularly when one side is saying something that is egregiously wrong, and to simply both sides it and play them off against each other, rather than really delving into what the situation is or what's going on. I don't think does anyone a service. And it's one of these things where I'm not sure that even some of the journalists themselves are necessarily thinking critically about what it is that they're writing. And there's a myriad of reasons for that. Some of it is just pressed for time. It's difficult to sometimes write critical pieces and get outside sources in the short amount of time that most of the mainstream outlets operate under. As well, not every journalist is going to know everything that's going on in terms of some of the minutiae of ins and outs of how things are going or progressing in certain areas, because in part, we have fewer journalists who have dedicated beats than we used to. A lot more journalists are generalists, and if you're assigned to a story for a day, you may not know all the backstory to it. Again, that's a question of resources. It's a question of kind of the way that news is shifted. And so that can make for difficult writing in terms of trying to place things in a proper context when you don't necessarily have all of that backstory and not a lot of time in order to delve into it and find it. So those are some of the things that we just kind of need to think about when it comes to journalism and stunts that are done for the sake of the media, that the media will pick up on, because yeah, I mean, it's the both sidesing, it's the exaggerated sense of fairness, and it's the lack of resources and institutional knowledge in some cases to engage more critically with what's going on. So that's why it's kind of important for news consumers to get a better sense of media literacy and to get a better sense of what it is that they're reading and why the both sidesing doesn't necessarily help, and to try and look through other sources to get a better sense of what is going on, because if you're getting it just from a single source, you may not get a fuller picture as if you read a similar story from 2 or 3 different sources. So that's kind of where my thoughts are on that. But it's a tough and very fraught question in the current media landscape. And that's everything for this week. Thank you for your questions. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.